Welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. It is great to see this many faces, particularly on such short notice. We know that y'all didn't have much time or heads up about this event, nor did we. This is one of these moments where we decided that there were so many things going on in the news right now. There were so many tragic incidents that happened over the last 2 weeks that we'd be remiss by waiting even longer, waiting for the next major tragedy to have something planned far in advance. So we wanted to make sure that while this was timely, while this was in the news, while this was on people's minds, we offered you, the students, an opportunity really to engage with some knowledgeable folks on our campus about this complex issue. My name's Jason Husser. I'm here because I'm a faculty fellow for civic engagement. I also teach in the political science department. I'm moderating this event tonight. And again, Elon has a commitment to provide opportunities for thoughtful dialogue on pressing national issues for our students, and we also want to make sure we do that in a timely manner following major national events. This is not the first time gun violence has been discussed at Elon University. Following the last couple weeks of shootings, we realized we needed to continue this conversation. Sadly, this will not be the last time Elon, as a community, as a university, discusses this topic, but we do want to make sure that we provide continued opportunities for student engagement. We hope that tonight's evening takes on a lively format. We don't have a huge crowd in this room, but there are some bright minds. I know so many of you here. I'm looking forward to the questions that you have to ask. We hope this evening really is more of a conversation. Yes, it's set up as a formal panel, and I have very distinguished panelists here, but don't think of this as a great formality. Feel comfortable, ask questions. You're among friends here. So again, please bring your questions. We are being filmed. There are a lot of folks who couldn't make it tonight due to the short notice, but we do hope that they are able to share this conversation with their students and with their classes. So do keep in mind that we are being filmed. One thing to keep in mind is that these conversations are difficult. These are tough questions. There are no easy answers to them. There are no simple answers, but this is still a civil discussion. It's not a debate. It's not a political rally. We want you to feel comfortable thoughtfully engaging in the messiness of it. That's what we do well at universities, engaging with messy things. To that end, I hope our conversation gets into the weeds of gun violence as a social phenomenon and doesn't become simply a sparring match between one side of a partisan aisle. We get enough of that on social media already. This is an opportunity as a university that we can really dig deeper and go deeper. We have about an hour. There's, again, no way to answer everything in this space, but one thing seems fundamental is that without moments like this, we will not make progress on these types of issues. I'd like to start by briefly reminding you about the importance of conversations like those tonight, conversations on violence associated with guns. Let's look at a few recent numbers. According to ABC News, the shooting at Northern Arizona University last week was the 47th school shooting in 2015. Of those shootings, 26 were classified as attacks that resulted in injury or death. The 21 remaining shootings were a mix of attempted or completed suicides, accidental shootings, or instances in which a gun was fired at a campus, including grade schools and colleges, but no one was injured. Statistics show that even though some of this year's individual shootings, like that at the community college in Oregon, where 10 people died, including the shooter, resulted in higher death counts than last year, the number of shootings is slightly lower than it was at this point in 2014. Compared to the 47 at this point, there were 50 shootings on school grounds by this time last year, 29 of which were attacks that resulted in injury or death, 3 more than this year. Vox.com provides further context. Under the broadest definitions of mass shootings, so those are in which 4 people or more were shot, these incidents killed about 500 Americans in 2013. That's a fraction of total gun homicides. More than 11,000 gun homicides happened in 2013, and firearm suicides killed even more, nearly 21,000 Americans. Based on 2013 data, there are approximately 92 deaths on average each day, gun deaths on average each day in America. About 30 per day are homicides, and roughly 58 are suicides. So that offers us some sort of numbers that this is a big deal. It happens often. Statistically, by the time that this event ends, a couple more people will have died from gun violence in the United States. Second, I'd like to share with you recent remarks from President Obama following the Oregon shooting. Regardless of your partisan affiliation, the president's message following the Oregon shooting introduces the parameters of national policy discussion. If you disagree with the president and his policies, this is a great opportunity to continue that discussion. Regardless, it sets the tone for, I hope, a productive discussion for the rest of the night. Go ahead and start that.
There's been another mass shooting in America, this time in a community college in Oregon. That means there are more American families, moms, dads, children, whose lives have been changed forever. That means there's another community stunned with grief, and communities across the country forced to relieve their own anguish, and parents across the country who are scared because they know it might have been their families or their children. I've been to Roseburg, Oregon. There are really good people there. I want to thank all the first responders whose bravery likely saved some lives today. Federal law enforcement has been on the scene in a supporting role, and we've offered to stay and help as much as Roseburg needs for as long as they need. In the coming days, we'll learn about the victims, young men and women who were studying and learning and working hard, their eyes set on the future, their dreams on what they could make of their lives. And America will wrap everyone who's grieving with our prayers and our love. But as I said just a few months ago, and I said a few months before that, and I said each time we see one of these mass shootings, our thoughts and prayers are not enough. It's not enough. It does not capture the heartache and grief and anger that we should feel. And it does nothing to prevent this carnage from being inflicted someplace else in America. Next week, or a couple of months from now. We don't yet know why this individual did what he did. And it's fair to say that anybody who does this has a sickness in their minds, regardless of what they think their motivations may be. But we are not the only country on earth that has people with mental illnesses or want to do harm to other people. We are the only advanced country on earth that sees these kinds of mass shootings every few months. Earlier this year, I answered a question in an interview by saying, the United States of America is the one advanced nation on earth in which we do not have sufficient common sense gun safety laws, even in the face of repeated mass killings. And later that day, there was a mass shooting at a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. That day. Somehow this has become routine. The reporting is routine. My response here at this podium ends up being routine. The conversation in the aftermath of it, we've become numb to this. We've talked about this after Columbine and Blacksburg, after Tucson, after Newtown, after Aurora, after Charleston. It cannot be this easy for somebody who wants to inflict harm on other people to get his or her hands on a gun. And what's become routine, of course, is the response of those who oppose any kind of common sense gun legislation. Right now, I can imagine the press releases being cranked out. We need more guns, they'll argue. Fewer gun safety laws. Does anybody really believe that? There are scores of responsible gun owners in this country. They know that's not true. We know because of the polling that says the majority of Americans understand we should be changing these laws, including the majority of responsible, law-abiding gun owners. There is a gun for roughly every man, woman, and child in America. So how can you, with a straight face, make the argument that more guns will make us safer? We know that states with the most gun laws tend to have the fewest gun deaths. So the notion that gun laws don't work or just will make it harder for law-abiding citizens and criminals will still get their guns, it's not borne out by the evidence. We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours. So we know there are ways to prevent it.
So here's an opening question to each of you that you can answer however you see fit. Collectively, you represent years of training and study in criminology, political science, journalism, and law enforcement. Tell us your views on a key point or two that we need to understand to have a productive conversation about violence associated with guns. Whoever wants to start.
I guess since I'm sitting on this side, I'll start. I mean, you can hear the frustration in the president's voice, and I think a lot of us are frustrated that these events happen and there seems to be inaction. I guess I'll play the pessimist. Political scientists are often just surprised that any action ever gets done. The system is built to protect the status quo. And so these focusing events sometimes shock us that after Sandy Hook or after this event, nothing has happened. It is, if we look at the civil rights movement, gay marriage, Obamacare, decades and decades and decades of passionate, long fight to get that type of legislation or that type of policy movement to occur. Unfortunately, although all of you, I think, are interested in gun control, it generally is tertiary or further down the line of your interest, and it becomes magnified at these points because of this focusing event, but then it dissipates quite quickly. Whereas we do have a vocal minority, very active minority that are fighting for gun rights, and that minority is able to use a variety of veto points that are built into our system, whether legislation can be bottled up in subcommittee in one chamber of a legislation, whether it's vetoed by a governor, whether it's passed by all branches of government, but then declared unconstitutional as certain the Chicago legislation in 2008 and 2010 overturned by the Supreme Court. So I think a lot of us are frustrated, but I think we need to look at incremental change rather than sort of an immediate solution that's going to be the magic bullet, sorry for the pun, that would solve this problem immediately just because we're focusing on this problem because of this one focusing event. So I understand my frustration, the president's frustration, your frustration, but I think we need to look at the broader political context to see what is politically feasible and possible when we approach this topic.
Whoever would like to go next. What are some things that we need to think about for a productive conversation?
I'll go next. So you said political scientists are pessimists. I'll be an optimist here, not focusing on gun control, but focusing on understanding patterns in homicide generally. So I think there's a general tendency for us always to feel like we're living in the worst, most dangerous time period that ever existed, and we're going to hell in a handbasket in every generation. And the good news is that we don't actually see that reflected in crime statistics. And the data that we have on homicide are the most reliable, best data that we have on any crime. The FBI puts out the Uniform Crime Report every year, which counts all homicides that happen in every year and tracks them over time and gives us information about circumstances in those homicides. One thing that we know is that 20 years ago, the homicide rate in the United States was 9 homicides per every 100,000 people in the population. That's how it's expressed as a rate. 20 years later, the most recent figures that we have for homicide rates are half of what they were 20 years ago, 4.5 per 100,000 versus 9 per 100,000. In fact, if we wanted to find a homicide rate in a year in the United States that was at the level we are now or lower, we'd actually have to go back to 1963. If we wanted to actually get lower than where we are now, we'd have to go back to 1957. In other words, we have the lowest rate of lethal violence than we've seen in 5 decades. And a lot of people don't realize that. We feel like we're in the most dangerous, most horrible time period that's ever existed because these horrible things happen. And they're horrible, and they're tragic, and they shouldn't happen. But we have to be aware that this isn't the most dangerous time period, at least in terms of murder, that we've ever lived in. We've certainly experienced in the past far greater risk of dying from homicide. But when we look at those homicide rates that we have now, we also see some pretty important patterns that speak to this conversation. So if we break down homicides by the weapon that's used in those homicides, what we find is in the United States, of the, I believe it was 12,253 homicides that happened in 2013, the most recent year for which we have this information, 8,000, let me get the exact number, 8,454 of those homicides were committed with firearms. So 69% of homicides in the most recent year for which we have data were committed with firearms. Of those firearm homicides, 68% were committed with handguns, making a total out of all of those homicides that occur, 47% are committed with handguns. So guns are a big part of the story of homicide in the United States, and they're the most common kind of gun that exists in the United States, handguns, as opposed to those that we often associate with these mass shootings, which are assault rifles and those kinds of weapons. And certainly if we compare even our very low homicide rates in the United States right now, that's a comparison of us to us. If we compare us to other countries that are similar to us in terms of economic development and in terms of political system, what we find is that those rates of homicide are 3, 4, 5, 6 times greater. Excuse me, ours is 4, 5, 6 times greater than those homicide rates. So even at our best point, we're still not doing that great.
Thank you.
So if the question is, how do we have this conversation? I'm actually kind of a pessimist because it's hard to have this conversation. It's hard to have it for several reasons. I'm a reporter, and so there's lots of fault all the way around. I think journalists need to do a better job of educating the public and, frankly, educating themselves. What is an assault weapon? Too often we report that somebody used an automatic weapon. An automatic weapon is a machine gun where you pull the trigger and it fires and fires and fires. A semi-automatic weapon is anything from a .38 pistol that shoots every time you pull the trigger to a rifle that shoots every time you pull the trigger. So the terminology is rather loose, but the First Amendment versus the Second Amendment. Many who are very, very strong advocates of gun ownership, the NRA, being the primary one, they're absolutists. They won't allow the conversation. They're absolute. The Second Amendment says, that we can bear arms, and by God, that's what it means. That's what it says. No gun safety discussion. Gun sales have gone through the roof since Barack Obama has been elected. There have been all sorts of propaganda pieces about how he was going to come after our guns. I don't know if you know this or not, but gun laws have been loosened in this country since Barack Obama's been in office. You can now carry an unloaded weapon on an Amtrak train in your luggage. You can take a loaded weapon into a national park. You couldn't do that before. So no guns are being confiscated. You can't ban guns. There are too many of them. It's an impossibility. But to have a discussion about it is also somewhat of an impossibility. So I don't typically buy guns and ammo, but I bought this issue because there is a back page written by a man named Dick Metcalf, who's in his 60s. His column was called The Backstop. And for some 27, 28 years, this man who owns dozens of weapons teaches gun safety classes. I think he's a sociologist. I'm not sure. He's taught at colleges. He wrote one column suggesting maybe let's let's talk limits. Let's at least open the discussion. And he makes the point accurately that other amendments and other constitutional issues are regulated. Free speech is not absolute. Free speech is not absolute. And so should the Second Amendment be the one that is absolute? As soon as this ran, he received personal death threats. Major gun manufacturers who advertise in guns and ammo said, we're pulling our advertising unless you fire this man immediately. He lost his television show. He was basically banned. You can't have, in many circles, a reasonable, open, calm, rational discussion, which is why I appreciate Jason asking me to be here tonight, because I feel like we are here. But I've tried to have those discussions. In 2012, I actually wrote a column about what Barack Obama should say to the country. It was after one of those shootings. Well, that was 13 mass shootings ago. And at that time, Barack Obama had not made any proposals whatsoever about serious gun control. And I got some really nasty, threatening letters. It's hard to discuss it in this country.
Thank you.
I think my response to this is there has to be middle ground. It almost seems that each side wants to draw a line in the sand and no one can cross it, or you're either a gun hater or you're just a gun lover. There's got to be middle ground, and there's got to be good solutions to these issues. And I do think that certain groups take advantage of that, and they use fear to make people think they can't exercise their constitutional rights.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Please come forward.
I have 2 points or questions. My first question would be, do y'all think that the Second Amendment is antiquated, considering its origin points, in order to form a state militia so that if the U.S. government ever became tyrannical, they could be revolted against by the people? Now we have drones, so you're bringing guns to a drone fight. It's not very useful. And then my second point would be, do you think that this inability to pass any federal gun control legislation is indicative of a larger problem of corruption within the government and the government's current incapacity to listen to what the people want. The amount of times that the government currently will pass legislation based on what the people want is the same as the amount of times they'll pass legislation without the people wanting it. So I guess what I'm asking is it impossible to pass gun control laws currently with people like the Koch brothers buying out campaigns and just because Wayne LaPierre says that we don't want any gun laws in this country.
So let's take the first one on sort of Second Amendment as it has evolved over time, and then perhaps we'll hold that other question about the political context. I know none of you profess to be law professors.
Yeah,
but.
I mean, I guess the Supreme Court has ruled that the Second Amendment means that we have a right to have a handgun at home. That does leave a lot of restrictions that could be placed on guns that are currently in effect in some places around the country. In New York City, it's very expensive, like $500 for a permit. It can be denied. Very, very few people are given a permit for a weapon in New York City. So there could be potentially, under our Constitution, lots of restrictions that could allow the regulation of guns. Outright bans of handguns just, I don't think under the current structure of the Supreme Court would happen. But I think the system, the constitutional system, allows us to regulate. The question is it politically feasible? Can we get it through Congress? And it seems that we have not been that successful.
The other issue is, you mentioned words like gun control. What does that look like? Are you talking about requiring people to lock up their weapons at night in a safe? What exactly do we mean by gun control? And I'm not asking you personally to get back up and define it necessarily, but gun control to Wayne LaPierre's ears is you're going to come after my weapons, and I'm not going to let you do that. The thing about background checks, gun show loopholes, and so on. Years ago, my father owned a drugstore, and it was broken into twice. So he went out and bought the first gun of his life. He bought a little .38 pistol. After keeping it for a while, he thought, I don't want this thing around. So, he gave it to me. And so what am I going to do with this? And so I took it target practice a couple of times, and I thought, I want to get rid of it. So I went to a deputy in North Carolina that I knew. I said, how do you legally sell a gun? He said, you can go to Food Line and say, do you want to buy a gun? And if somebody hands you the money, then you can walk away. I said, you're kidding. No registration, no paperwork, no nothing. He said, yep. So, those are the kinds of laws that I think, many would like to address. And frankly, Dennis, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I know that North Carolina and other states have talked about loosening, like legal gun purchases, that you don't have to go to the sheriff anymore to get a permit, and streamlining that process. And I know that some law enforcement have been against that. They would rather have a paper trail. So what can you say about that?
Gun control takes a different meaning for the state you come from. I'm from Illinois. We were the last state in the union, I believe, to get concealed carry, which was passed, I think, in 13 or 14. I'd already moved to North Carolina. And the first time I walked to a landscape store and there was a guy with a pistol strapped to his side, I was taken aback because as a police officer in Illinois, the police carried guns. The citizens of the community did not do that openly. But I've always struggled to understand why people are get so distraught over the background check or the 7-day waiting period. And there is a process, and to go here in North Carolina, to go through the sheriff's office to get a permit, it's just one more step to verify that they've got the credentials they need or the training they need. So I would not advocate loosening those. In Illinois, you had to have a firearm owner's ID card to purchase ammunition. So here you can just walk into Walmart and buy it over the counter. So it was a little bit of an adjustment for me when I came to North Carolina, but I'm not sure why people get so upset over needing to wait 3 or 4 days or 7 days, whatever the state's mandate on a waiting period. It seems rational to me.
Any other takes on that? Do we have other student questions? I sure hope so. Let's see. I'll take a non-student question.
Don't be shy.
It's actually a question for Chief Franks, but anybody also can answer. I'm curious, and it may be, maybe I know this answer as I'm asking the question, but why police forces haven't banded together more to talk about maybe reasonable gun issues when, it feels like I was having a conversation with you where you said in the United States you're trained to assume that everybody is armed if you're in some conversation, an altercation, and it just strikes me it might be a lot easier if that wasn't the case, or at least there was more regulation of guns in terms of, so is that because people grow up with different individual ideas about government involvement or different notions of gun culture? Is that kind of the reason why?
I grew up in the Midwest. My house was full of guns. My dad was an outdoorsman. My wife grew up in Washington, D.C. She did not grow up with guns in the house, so it was a mix. It was an adjustment for her. But I think it's just where you come from. Mm-hmm. It's Kentucky. I'm sure you saw them all the time.
That's right.
And the police, I always use this example. Police are human. They're just regular folks also. Mm-hmm. Some are very avid outdoorsmen and have all kinds of guns. Myself, I have a couple just because by virtue of my profession, I have to have some. I think there's such a mix. It's not, there's a lot of times there's an assumption, well, you're a police officer, you're a gun nut. I've had that question asked to me before.
I was actually thinking in the reverse, that maybe police officers might have all those individual perspectives, but may say professionally, it is to our advantage to have perhaps stricter controls on other people
And I
having
think if you were to
guns.
poll, I know from my prior department, most of the officers I worked with were advocates for concealed carry because they felt that reduced the likelihood of crime occurring.
Can I ask another question about that? Because that was
Sure.
my second one. I noticed in the Oregon shooting, and many of you also read this, there was a veteran who had a concealed carry permit and had a gun on the
From Randleman.
premises. Excuse me?
Is it the Randleman, North Carolina?
I think so, yes. But said, I didn't feel like I could do anything with my gun because I thought I would be shot and mistaken for the shooter. So I just wonder how that works in terms of concealed carry and somebody, there is a notion that there would be good Samaritans who could jump in and do things, but it felt like in that case, there was a highly trained person with a gun who didn't feel like he could use it.
And there are always, I use the term that the situation dictates the tactic. So he could have been in a position that maybe he couldn't get that out without giving himself up or maybe causing someone else to get hurt. I don't know.
Hi. So I'm not familiar with Elon's off-campus policy, but I was wondering more towards Dennis Franks, what kind of policies there are for students who do live in off-campus housing, what their gun situation is like, if they are allowed to own guns or whatnot.
That would be the same as any other citizen. The university police only regulate on campus.
Thank you.
That sort of ties into exactly where I was going with my question. I heard a piece on NPR this afternoon. An economics professor at the University of Texas resigned today because the University of Texas is now a public university campus where students are allowed to carry concealed weapons. And he said he calls it in his article the showdown at Econ Corral. He said, I'm just not going to work under those circumstances. And one of the things he said was, if you believe that you're walking around your college campuses and you believe that you're walking around in a safe place where there aren't any guns, you're massively confused. He said, if you don't believe it, ask your students. And so I want to do that. Do you guys, are you aware? Are people around you, do you know of people who have guns on campus? Does that ever happen that we know of? That makes me feel better. I just think it's a terrifying prospect, the notion of guns on a college campus, public university or otherwise.
We have additional questions from students or audience members.
I'm just curious what your opinions are on how media covers the mass shootings in particular, and if you have any ideas how they could report on the same issues in a better way or safer way.
I'll start. I was struck by the shooting in which the law enforcement refused to name the shooter. And it was interesting because I think, news media have a responsibility to report all the facts. And so we have to give the name of the shooter, the age, where he's from, and so on. That's what we do. I do think that, and frankly, I like this trend of, okay, here's his name, and I'm not going to mention it again. Or in a newspaper article, it's, a 22-year-old gunman, and then you got his name way down in the piece. And you might have more pictures of the scene or, relatives, friends, that sort of thing, rather than a huge photo. In one of my classes, I talk about the controversy over the Boston bomber and the one who survived, the brother who survived. Rolling Stone had him on the cover. And a lot of people said he looks like a rock star because it was a nice picture of him. It was a big, full-color photo. And Rolling Stone did an expose, if you will, or a background on him. But the cover is saying, on the newsstand beside Vogue and all that, and it glamorized him in a way. And you wonder how often that does create copycats. So I think that, maybe we we report accurately, but we don't, you know, I don't think that in most cases, straightforward, objective news media, you know, glamorize these shootings. In fact, they show the heartache and the heartbreak and that sort of thing. As I mentioned a moment ago, I do think that accuracy, you know, I worry in the digital age that we're tweeting out how many people are dead before we know how many people are dead. Where, you know, the rumors fly. And, you know, when I started in newspapers, I found out, you know, and it was the next morning I had time to do some reporting. Now it's, you know, within 30 seconds, you know, somebody's hitting a button. And so that's a problem. And as I was talking with Dennis right before this began, I'm always telling my student journalists, be right before you're first. I don't care if you're first, but be accurate. So that's my 2 cents.
And I would weigh in on that as well. From a sociological perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on the role that, you know, epidemic thinking plays in creating self-fulfilling prophecies through contagion. So like the way you were talking about the discussion in media accounts of, you know, what is the number of victims? And then what becomes more important is the comparison of particular events to previous events. So has this broken the record that was set by Sandy Hook? Has this broken the record that was set by the Virginia Tech shooting? When you create records exist to be broken. And so for those who are motivated to do that, you have set the standard for that record breaking. And so that kind of sensational reporting, even if it's accurate, even if it doesn't seem particularly sensational, by making those comparisons sets up those records. There's also been a lot of more recent talk sociologically about what's going on, using this idea of contagion, saying that we need to start thinking about the importance of epidemic-like violence in terms of individual thresholds for violence. That is, maybe in the early years of school shootings, when we started seeing these happening more frequently in the 1990s, mostly happening in middle and high schools, we had cases of those who had very low thresholds, meaning they weren't especially susceptible to the effects of role models, but either were suffering from extreme psychosis, delusional thinking that compelled them to violence, or were textbook cases of psychopaths. So the Columbine shooting, Kip Kinkle, and those kinds of cases. But as events become more common, those with higher thresholds, those who wouldn't act in the absence of those models, now have a cultural script to draw on to practice out this kind of violent fantasy that they might be playing with. And I would to speak to the media question, I think that the media is important through its effect on us. So if you can break that record and cause that bloodshed and, you know, create that awe and that fear that you seek to create, you can only do that if you know that people are scared, if you know that you have that effect on people through the media. But I mean, I've talked to enough people who are teenagers and in their early 20s to know that they're not sitting around watching CNN, that a lot of the discussions of this aren't happening in response to those media accounts, but indirectly through, you know, the dark channels of the internet.
Do you have a statement or a question?
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. I just have a few points, and if you don't mind, I'll take maybe 3 and 4 minutes.
Thank you.
If you have your permission. First of all, I'm very glad that this conversation is taking place, and I hope that from here it goes on to the national level. I think we have not had enough conversation on this problem of violence. My first question is, do you all think that American people really realize that this kind of mass murder is a problem? My answer is that no, they don't. Actually, they get caught up into this kind of a statistic. The crime rate is down, which indeed is down. But the fact is that this is a very different kind of violence. It's not the same crime kind of murders that used to take place are taking place on our street. It's mass murder committed by very young people. It's a different genre of violence. And I don't think, personally, you may disagree with me, but I don't think that the American people really are convinced that that's the problem. So that's the first thing where the conversation has to go, to try to convince the people that, yes, it is a national social problem. That's the first thing. The other point is about the gun. Most of the discussion has taken place here about the guns and the gun control. Even the President of the United States, whom I respect very much, I am a Democrat, I love him, but I think his emphasis is wrongly placed. Guns are not the cause of violence. There used to be, I hate NRA, but they used to have this cliche, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that's really exactly true. There are countries in this world, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and I know for sure that they have lots and lots of per capita guns, but they do not have this kind of violence. So what's going on here? That's the question. The idea of gun control, controlling the guns in American society, we are never going to control them, my friends. No. As long as there is this constitutionally guaranteed right to bear arms, we will never have gun controls effective in this country. Even if we could, there are millions of guns that the President himself said in private hands. They will be in circulation for endless of time. You'll never be able to control them. Some people will find guns if they want to have guns. I think that we have to place issue in someplace else. The other thing is mental health. Is mental health really the problem? I think the defendants of these criminals, I would call them, have used that as a cop-out. It's a sick person. And sick persons do this kind of thing. No, sir. Mental health is not a problem which is causing this kind of violence. These are not mentally deranged people. These are people who are thinking, planning, concocting, and taking a very deliberate action for whatever reasons I do not know. Those are the reasons that we have got to find out. There are some kind of large-scale social and psychological causes that are responsible for this kind of thing in this country. And I like all of us, not here, but outside there, to think about it. Why do some apparently good-looking young people coming from relatively affluent homes, educated homes, why are they committing this kind of crime? That's where the focus of our conversation, I would like. Maybe there's something is not right in their environment, in their family environment particularly, there's something is not right there. Maybe they feel powerless. Maybe they feel alienated. Maybe they feel rejected. I do not know. But I think if that kind of conversation gets going on a larger scale, we can probably make some headway here. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I'm so glad you said all that. There was one thing I wanted to talk about, and I actually had sent my notes to Jason earlier, and he probably, if he read them, he saw that I wrote, I don't really want to talk about mental health, and I don't really want to just talk about guns. If we were to take, I'm going to talk statistics now, but I think you'll like the way I'm doing it. If we were to take every single firearm-related homicide in the United States and throw it out, pretend it didn't happen, we would still have a homicide rate in this country, so only counting stabbings, strangulation, asphyxiation, blunt force trauma, and so on. If we looked only at non-gun homicides in the United States, we would still have a higher homicide rate in the US than, let's see, I wrote these things down. I told you I take notes. I'll go off the top of my head. Then Australia, then New Zealand, then Japan, then Singapore, then Indonesia, then Sweden, Austria, Germany, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and so on, right? In other words, and that's if you allow them to include their firearm-related homicides in their homicide rates. The story is obviously a lot about guns. That is, our homicide rates are so much higher in part because the opportunities for lethal violence are so much greater here. But it's not the only story. And the story shouldn't begin and end with guns, nor with mental health. It has to be about us culturally. And without that, we miss the broader point. That is, what is going on culturally? And so I'm glad that you brought that up.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. I was reading a piece the other day that said that it's not mental health, it's anger plus opportunity. And there are people with anger issues. I commute on I-40 every day, and I can tell you anecdotally that anger is on the rise. I grew up in, like you grew up in Illinois, and Brooke grew up in Kentucky. I grew up in rural eastern North Carolina. And, guns were part of the culture. I had a shotgun, a rifle hanging on my bedroom wall. I also have seen more and more bumper stickers with things like gun control means holding it with both hands. This truck protected by Smith & Wesson. We don't dial 911, There's, I don't know, it seems to be more of a chip on the shoulder. The NRA used to be an organization that offered guidance in terms of target practice and how to, gun safety. It was a gun safety organization, and it seems to have taken a more militant stance, and that's a problem. And I was talking earlier about the First Amendment versus the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment about guns, there are gun shows, gun shops, gun classes, gun clubs. I'm still looking for the First Amendment show, the First Amendment club, the First Amendment defiance. It's a different culture. And so that's interesting what you were saying about the homicides minus the guns. I definitely think we have a cultural issue, and and this seems a stretch in a way, but I still don't understand why young men and women from good homes in Europe and here leave to go join ISIS. Is it exciting? Or is it propaganda? So there's something that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. See, the problem with this gun debate is that we get just locked into it. There are strong lobbies for guns and against guns. And that's where we just end up. It's a loggerhead. We don't make any headway. We haven't made any headway.
I don't think anyone wants to, like you said, it's scare tactics on both sides of the argument, and no one wants to step in the middle.
So let's move on to something else. Let's start talking about something else. What's going on in our culture, in our society, in our homes, in the heads of our young people that they would do this? It's not poverty, not education. Because if you look at the histories of these fellows who have done it, as I said, they're coming from affluent, white American homes, all of them.
If you look back at the Columbine shooting, what came out of that? That was where you started talking, a lot of talk about bullying in school. And then we had this anti-bullying program. Similar, like when I was in high school, they pushed the anti-smoking. And now you see very few people smoke. And, what is that, 1999, I think Columbine occurred. Mm-hmm. Now in 2015, my kids, who were born right around 2000, they really pushed the bullying in school, and they're free to go talk to people and say, don't bully me, don't do this, but they're still happening. So was the bullying argument the wrong argument? I guess I pose a question.
I'm going to get to a student question, but before then, this brings up a point that I wanted to ask was, should we be viewing this issue as in some ways a public health issue? So I'm thinking about it broader than just one sort of solution, but a broader public health solution as we think of a lot of issues. And if so, what sort of context could we put it in? Anybody? Ken has some statistics I looked over my shoulder and saw them. So.
Well, Congress has prevented the CDC from studying this as a public health issue, and I think we find that the statistics show that if you have a gun, you're actually less safe. It provides opportunity for children to get involved in access to those guns. Depression leads to suicide. One of the leading causes of firearm deaths is suicide. So I think we look at this, it does bring up the mental health issue, but think of it as a public health issue, access to guns, access to alcohol, access to tobacco, all these things are dangerous, right? And we can educate ourselves about these issues. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to ban tobacco, ban alcohol, or ban guns. So we need to sort of provide an education system that says, look, these things are dangerous, right? You have free will, you have the ability to make your own choices, but these choices also affect other people, like secondhand smoke. But owning a gun requires responsibility because other people can get access to it and therefore harm other people. So I think seeing this as a larger public health problem does start to open it up to other issues simply than banning guns. So I think that is a smart way of looking at it, and it would be nice if the CDC could actually spend money to do research in that field.
The question here, then.
Okay, so if we look at constitutional law, we see that all the rights and freedoms that we have are subject to, quote, reasonable restriction. Or if we look at, what is it? It's a Casey, or Planned Parenthood versus Casey, it's undue burden, that you cannot place an undue burden of restriction upon this right. So what gun regulation, gun control scheme, or a scheme could be formed that is reasonable, that is seen as reasonable by the broad swath of the population, that still does not place an undue burden on what perhaps is the most meaningful right or sub-right of the Second Amendment, which is the right to defend yourself. And how do we make people understand that we only want, that there should be reasonable restriction, and reasonable restriction is allowable by the Constitution, but it doesn't come off as we're coming for your guns?
Yeah, after Sandy Hook, there was legislation that was proposed, and part of it incorporated the assault weapons ban to renew that, which expired in, was it 2004? I can't remember. And so that was actually used as sort of like, okay, we'll put the assault weapons ban, knowing that we'll get rid of that, placate gun advocates, and then get more background checks or a waiting period. But it didn't work. And so there is this sort of game playing in that you try to make legislation extremely punitive on guns and then back down to get at least something. But after Sandy Hook, we really got nothing out of Congress. Even though when we surveyed, Jason and I, 2013, North Carolinians, 51% think more restrictions on handguns isn't appropriate. 90% want a background check. 80% want a waiting period. So we clearly have a supermajority who wants something. But again, as I mentioned before, there's so many veto points in our political system that it's so easy for a very, very vocal, active minority to be able to stymie those results.
If we're also going to talk about gun control, maybe we need to change the conversation a little bit. Instead of focusing on policies about access, maybe we need to think about changes that limit use. So in criminology, we talk about something called situational crime prevention. That is, if you assume that there is a motivated offender, by altering the circumstances of the situation, you can reduce the opportunity for offending. And if you've ever seen like ink tags, for instance, on clothing, if you've ever seen a railing somewhere that had spikes on it so someone couldn't sit down, that's all situational crime prevention. And a lot of this focuses on guns as well. So how do you limit access to guns to those who shouldn't have it? One way is through the manufacturing of smart guns. So the only people who could operate them would be the person who actually owns them. And so those are other approaches that are used to limit opportunities without having necessarily the same political battles, I think, over limiting access to the purchase of weapons.
That works for new guns, but...
Yeah, not for the 300 million that are in circulation, yeah.
But presumably that would impact accidental shootings or suicides and new guns as well. Another question?
So I'm not from the United States. I'm from a small group of islands in the Caribbean. And when I came to the States, one of the things that I was very concerned about was all the gun violence and the school shootings and stuff, because that makes international news, and that's something that I saw. So before I came stateside, I looked up a lot of different gun laws for the U.S., and of course it varies by state and everything. And one thing that I've never heard people really talk about, and that seemed like such an important thing to discuss, but seems to always get left out of the conversation, is that I've got family in the Canadian military and in the United States military, and I've had firearm training. And one thing that never seems to get addressed with these different school shootings and stuff that's happened is quite often the firearms are not actually owned by these individuals that are doing the shootings. They're owned by family members, relatives, and they were only able to get their hands on these weapons because they were not being properly contained as the law requires within safes with trigger guards on, etc. And my question is, why aren't these people also being brought to the stage? Because whilst they aren't committing the crimes themselves, they are allowing for these crimes to occur in the first place. If you know that your child is being bullied in school or has a mental disorder or whatever the situation may be, you should not leave a .45 laying out on your nightstand, because you're only going to you're presenting the opportunity to them. That's my question.
Now, North Carolina is, of the 2 states I've been a police officer, North Carolina has a criminal charge for leaving a firearm accessible to someone that uses it to hurt someone else or themselves.
We see some cases like Sandy Hook where it's the family member themselves that suffer directly from it.
I just kind of wanted to bring the international perspective to it because I did grow up in Switzerland, and Switzerland is often used as an example, and I find that very interesting considering I did grow up in an environment and I do see the very different way that guns are handled in Switzerland. And I just find it interesting considering last night's debate on how Bernie Sanders compares what his views are to what he sees in Denmark and what he wants to see happening in the United States, and how people attack him for comparing the United States to Denmark, saying that they're very different countries and things like that, but then they're very fine comparing, taking Switzerland as a case study and saying, look, it works in Switzerland, why can't it work here? Everyone has a gun, which in itself is a false fact. But my kind of question is, with a media that loves fact-checking, what is the responsibility of the media to kind of look into these comparisons and shine a light on the fact that, in fact, people in Switzerland, not every single person has access to a gun, and that it's not a good case study to take to compare the United States to Switzerland and use that as an excuse to say we don't need to change gun control, gun legislation because it works in Switzerland, therefore it should work here too. So kind of the role of what the media should play in shining a light on these kind of facts that are a little bit off.
There's a whole type of journalism called explanatory journalism. It's like, okay, here's the claim, here's how many people live here, here's how many people live there. And so I agree with you. There should be more in-depth explanation rather than saying, here's what Bernie Sanders said. I mean, that's taking dictation. And so, yeah, it should go down deeper. I think last night during the debate, Anderson Cooper at one point said Denmark is a country of 5.4 million people, and I thought, wow, that's impressive. So obviously he had looked it up because Sanders has mentioned it so often. But there needs to be more challenge that way, and I am much more explanatory journalism. The flip side of that is, reporters who do dig down deep and provide those explanations, sadly, too many people read the headline and maybe the first paragraph of a story and don't go any further. Or they look at the tweet on their phone and say, oh, okay, did you know? And there's no more critical thinking. And so it's a responsibility on the news media's part, but it's also a responsibility on the audience's part, frankly, to have more critical thinking on this issue.
We only have 9 minutes left, so I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to offer 1 or 2 key points that we should take away from this discussion tonight, particularly to help us think about the issue going forward.
In any particular order, or
however you want to go?
Just going forward, I would just say, Jason opened tonight with talking about how a college campus is a place for the open discussion of ideas, and I think this has been wonderful, that we've had this civil exchange of ideas. And so I just think that going forward, we need to not be afraid to talk about these hard issues. I don't think either side should be afraid. And when we take such polar extremist positions, extremism on the left, extremism on the right, it's just not healthy. It's not healthy. We need to meet in the middle, as Dennis said.
I'll close with a little short story here. In 1999, one of my police officers had come in. This was in Illinois, and he was a school resource officer. And another student came forward and said, "Hey, my friend something's not right." And as he followed up on that and was checking on the welfare of the student, he uncovered a book that this student had written, and it had a list of people. And that was his, as you saw, there was something in Cary or Apex today, but it was a list of people that he was going to kill. And it was only that this was stopped and solved is because his fellow students and friends had come forward to the police. And that's why I say I encourage people, if you have concerns, especially here at the university, there are all kinds of resources to reach out to express your concerns of people, for people.
Okay. I would say I'm really glad that you all came out today to discuss this, and I hope moving forward you will, when you have these conversations, hopefully with your friends and other people in your life, that you'll figure out a way to talk about these things that move beyond the basic narratives we hear that focus almost exclusively on guns and mental health, and think about those cultural factors and make sure that you're thinking beyond just the general stories that we're accustomed to hearing on these topics.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, access to gun is something that we spend a lot of time on, but we also mentioned mental health. We mentioned culture. How do we change any of those things given the complexity of these? And I think these discussions are important. How can we change our violent culture or gun culture? Is it possible? Well, we've made headways when it comes to smoking. We've made headways to a variety of different things. I think we're not going to stop talking about this. Firearm deaths, although we're seeing the numbers have declined since the height of homicide rates in 1991, they are about to surpass the number of car crash fatalities. And as one of the leading deaths starts to emerge as firearm deaths, we're going to keep talking about this issue. And eventually maybe we will start to see it as a public health issue. And maybe we will be able to get towards a middle ground, right? Right now it seems that there's a polarization, but I think eventually calmer heads will eventually be able to push legislation that can have a compromise, waiting periods, education, gun safety training, a whole battery of issues that are sort of packaged as common sense legislation, not restrictive, trying to take away your guns, but common sense protections that protect you and your family and your loved ones.
Well, thanks everybody. I promised folks I'd get you out of here at 8:15 sharp, so I'm erring on the side of caution with that. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. This is a difficult conversation to discuss. I'm proud of folks in this room for coming with informed and thoughtful questions, and thanks to each of you for taking the time to hear them out. One thing, students, I want to ask is that don't limit your discussion to these big issues, to these hour-long events that we bring about after a tragedy happens. Your generation of students have to solve a lot of these problems, and the only way that's going to happen is by continuing conversations on your own that start in places like this. So thanks all for being here.